Hello everyone. The sun was setting over the beach, casting a warm golden glow across the sand. I had always loved this time of day when everything felt calm and peaceful. I was sitting there quietly watching the waves roll in and out when I heard footsteps approaching. Turning my head slightly, I saw Mike, my mom's close friend, walking toward me. His presence was comforting, but it stirred something confusing inside me, a feeling I wasn't ready to confront. Mind if I join you? He said in a low, smooth. Mike had been with me for as long as I could remember, always helping my mom with something or other. He was also reliable, charming, and much more laid back than most adults. Perhaps that's why I'd always felt comfortable around him, but recently something had changed between us. It wasn't obvious yet, but I could feel it when he sat down next to me so that his leg touched mine. It was a slight touch, but it made me acutely aware of him in a way I hadn't been before. We began talking about random topics like the beach, a show we'd both seen, and how my mom was doing with her most recent project. His teasing made me laugh as usual, but tonight there was a subtle tension in the air that I couldn't explain, but it was impossible to ignore. How come you spend so much time out here? He asked after a while, his voice softer now, just clearing my head. I shrugged, even though it wasn't the whole truth. Being here away from everything made it easier to think about him and the conflicting emotions I was trying to sort out, but I couldn't say that aloud about what he asked as he leaned slightly toward me. His eyes were on me in a way that made my skin prickle, and all of a sudden I felt like he wasn't just engaging in small talk. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond because the truth felt too dangerous. I muttered things in the hopes that it would end there, but he looked at me for a long time, searching as if he expected me to say more. I knew it wasn't right when he looked at my mom or anyone else, but I couldn't help the way I felt when I was around him. There was something about his quiet confidence, the way he seemed so real, and it had been building for weeks now, little by little, with every lingering glance and casual touch. Instead of feeling nervous, I felt a strange thrill. Mike was much older than me, and he was my mom's friend, for crying out loud, but I couldn't help it. As we conversed, I found myself paying attention to the little things, like how his laugh was genuine and deeper, how the light bounced off his tan skin, and how his fingers drummed lightly on the sand next to him. When he paused between sentences, everything he did seemed to be amplified, as if my senses were tuned especially to him. Our conversation then returned to a light-hearted movie that he had been meaning to show my mom, and I tried to concentrate on the words, but I kept getting sidetracked by it. It was getting darker and the beach was emptying out, and the sound of the waves grew louder as the background noise of other people faded, leaving just the two of us in the soft glow of twilight. Although I knew I should be the one leaving, I didn't want him to leave because we were sitting there and there wasn't much room between us anymore. Every now and then, our arms or legs would brush, and every time my heart stutters, I pretended not to notice. First, our hands briefly touched by accident. This could have been dismissed as nothing, but instead we both stopped and the air seemed to thicken. I quickly pulled my hand back, trying to act normal, but I could feel my pulse quicken. I looked up at him, and he was watching me with that same intense look, as if he was waiting for something, as if he was as uncertain about what was happening between us as I was. For the remainder of the evening, that tension lingered between us, unsaid but heavy. Mike hesitated for a moment, looking down at me as if he wanted to say something, but then he just smiled a little too casually and said good night. See you around. Yes, see you. I replied, my voice a little too soft, my heart still racing, as I watched him walk away. We didn't talk about it, we didn't acknowledge the shift, but it was there, undeniable, and thrilling. It was a quiet afternoon when I heard the doorbell ring. My mom was out running errands, so I knew it had to be Mike. He had offered to come by and help with a leaky faucet in the kitchen that had been bugging us for weeks. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to open the door, my stomach doing that strange fluttering thing it always did when he was around. Alone in the darkening evening, I knew I had crossed into dangerous territory, and so had he. Whatever this was between us, it wasn't just going to go away. Said, grinning, while holding a toolbox in one hand. His tall, laid-back demeanor at my doorstep made my heart race, as it always did. He entered, and as he passed me, I smelled his cologne, which I knew was a blend of the warm summer air. I shut the door behind him, feeling anxious. I tried to speak steadily as I guided him through the house, my heart pounding, but I didn't want to show how much he affected me because I was supposed to be acting. He put his toolbox on the counter and knelt down beneath the sink, and I couldn't help but watch him. His movements were confident and easy, and I couldn't help but notice how his shirt hung over his shoulders as he worked. It was absurd how much it made my heart skip a beat. "You're quiet today," he said, looking up at me with a playful smile. "Everything's okay, just thinking," I muttered, trying to be calm, but in reality, my mind was racing. He finished working beneath the sink and got up, wiping his hands on a rag that should do it. He said, smiling as he always did after fixing something, "Give it a test." I reached for the faucet, but as I did, my hand brushed against his arm. The touch sent a shock through me, and the small kitchen felt even smaller. Being alone in the house was making everything feel more intense. There was almost no space between us when I turned on the faucet. The water flowed smoothly, but I was only able to notice how close we were standing, the warmth radiating from him, and the way his eyes flicked from my hand to my face, lingering just a little too long. I said, "Looks like you fixed it," in a softer than intentional voice, but he didn't back down, and we just stood there, the sound of the water filling the silence. Our eyes locked in a way that briefly made my heart race. It felt like everything had been building to this moment. His lips were soft at first, tentative as if testing the waters, but the second they touched mine, a spark ignited inside me, and the kiss deepened slowly and intensely. I was imagining the pull between us, the way his gaze seemed to linger on my lips, but then he leaned in just a little, his breath warm against my skin, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in too, closing the gap between us. It felt like the world had stopped everything else from fading away until it was just the two of us standing there in the kitchen, the heat between us undeniable. I hadn't realized how much I had wanted this, how much I had been craving this moment until it was happening, but that's when Mike pulled back just as abruptly as it started. His hand slid up to cut my face, and his thumb lightly brushed my cheek as he pulled me closer. He stepped back and ran a hand through his hair, looking everywhere, but at me. "We shouldn't have done that," he muttered. "I know," I whispered, even though every part of me was still buzzing from the kiss. It felt wrong, but it also felt like the most natural thing in the world. He stood there for a moment, seemingly struggling with what to do next, the tension between us still thick and unresolved. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same one I felt inside knowing this was dangerous. He finally said in a low voice, "Yeah, okay," and I replied, my heart sinking, as he grabbed his toolbox and made his way to the door. He paused for a moment, looking back at me as if he wanted to say something else, but then he simply nodded and left, leaving me standing there, breathless and bewildered, as the door clicked shut behind him. I leaned against the counter, my mind racing. I knew this was wrong, that we had crossed a line we shouldn't have, but the days following the kiss were a blur of confusion and guilt, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the memory of him kept coming back to me. I couldn't stop thinking about how his lips had felt against mine, how his hands had held my face, and the warmth that rushed through me when we were close. It was obviously wrong, but that only made it harder to resist. I didn't know what to do, and the internal conflict was. Part of me knew that this wasn't just a harmless crush anymore. It was something bigger and more genuine. However, the other part of me that felt the thrill whenever I thought of Mike was louder. We hadn't spoken since that day, but I knew it couldn't stay that way because there were too many unspoken things between us and too much tension left hanging. So one evening I found myself texting him, "We need to talk," and he responded quickly. Eventually, we decided to meet at the beach where it all began. I told myself that I was going there to stop it and get my mind straight, but I wasn't sure if that was true. When I arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in gentle pink and orange hues. Mike was already waiting, standing by the water with his hands in his pockets. He appeared tense, and I could feel the weight of what we were going to talk about pressing down on me. "Hey," he said softly as I approached him, his eyes sweeping my face as if. My heart was racing, and I could feel the same pull between us that had always existed, but now it felt heavier and more dangerous. We stood there in silence for a moment, the waves crashing softly in the background, before Mike spoke again. "I've been thinking about that day, when he said, his voice low and rough, as if he was having trouble finding the right words to describe what happened between us. So have I admitted that my voice was barely above a whisper? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and looked as conflicted as I did. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. His words gave me a rush, but they also made my stomach turn with guilt. This was exactly what I had been afraid of. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was something bigger, something we couldn't ignore. I feel the same way, I confessed, the words slipping out before. I could stop them, but we can't continue doing this, Mike. We shouldn't have kissed, and we shouldn't even be here right now. I know, he whispered, moving closer, his eyes meeting mine, but I can't help myself, and I don't think you can either. He was right, and I hated that he was right, but I couldn't help but be drawn to him. No matter how hard we tried to resist, the pull that seemed to pull us together was too great, and the worst part was that I didn't want to fight it any longer. We can't let anyone know that I said the words, and I hate that I want this. I whispered more to myself than to him, and Mike looked at me with the same mixture of desire and guilt that had been in his eyes ever since the incident. Mom, not anyone, this has to stay between us. Mike nodded, his expression grim, but he agreed that no one can find out. We both knew what we were risking: my mom's trust, our reputations, everything. Right then, though, none of it seemed to matter. I wanted to be strong enough to say that we should stop this before it went any further, but the truth was that I didn't know if I could walk away either, even with the risks and the guilt gnawing at me. I wanted more, and the worst part was that I knew he did too. Quietly, he said, "Kiss, you're not the only one. I've been trying my hardest to stay away and do the right thing, but I'm not sure if I can." Mike finally broke the silence, saying, "I should go," though his voice was full of hesitation, as if he didn't really want to leave. "Yeah," I replied, tightening my throat, "you should." But neither of us moved, even though we knew we had crossed a line that we could never uncross. The kiss had opened a door, and now there was no turning back no matter what. Decisions hung between us like a storm cloud about to break. The future felt hazy and dangerous, like we were walking a tightrope without a safety net, but all I could think about was what would happen next, what the next time would feel like, and what we would do. As much as we wanted to act otherwise, he finally took a step back, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer. "I don't know where this is going," he admitted in a soft voice, "but I can't stop." I swallowed hard, my heart thumping in my chest. "Nor can I." Mike turned to leave, and as he did, he gave me one last look. His eyes were filled with the same mix of confusion and desire that I felt. As I watched him leave, my mind was racing, and my heart was torn between excitement and fear. We had no idea what was going to happen, how we would keep this secret, or how long it would last, but one thing was certain. We had crossed a line, and while I was sitting by myself in my room, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind: the kiss, the way Mike looked at me, the way my heart raced when he was close, and I knew it was wrong. Every part of me cried out that we shouldn't have crossed that line, but I still wanted more. Was it right to keep this a secret? Could I really let this go any farther? I thought about my mother and the consequences if anyone found out, but it seemed impossible to stop and never feel that rush again. What should I write in the comments section? What advice would you give the heroine?